Thinking Basketball Podcast. My name is Ben. Welcome back to another episode. And Cody, when I was a kid, they had these tongue twisters, right? She sells seashells down by the seashore and all these things. And that one really tripped me up. But the one I could always do was Peter Piper picking peppers because of all the P's, all the alliteration of the P. You know what I'm talking about? Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled. Can you do that?
I don't know the whole thing because I think there's like 3 lines to it. But that's the one that's like, I should have it in front of me. Peter Piper picked a peck of.
yeah, exactly. Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. A peck of pickled peppers Peter Piper picked. Yeah.
Is there a third line to it? Is there another?
If Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers, where's the peck of pickled peppers Peter Piper picked? Did I get through it?
I think so. I think the thing that threw me off when I was a youngin' trying to do it is I thought it was pack and not peck. Like I didn't realize peck was a unit of measurement in all this. Let me try one more time. Just for the one line. Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. All right, I feel good about that.
That was really good.
Okay,
that was really good. Yeah,
next time, maybe I'll do 2 lines.
When I was a kid, I just said a bunch of P words. I definitely did not stick to the pick or the peck. You just say anything. When you go fast enough, you say anything. It's like singing Crossroads by Bones, Thug and Harmony. If you just go fast enough and just throw in, you miss your uncle or whatever.
I was thinking more like Pearl Jam. Like if you just kind of like...
Oh, they don't... You mean like Yellow Ledbetter? That doesn't have lyrics.
Yeah, like even though that kind of thing. Yeah.
So I was on Twitter this week, one of the first times ever. Because I saw this thing about the Lakers free throw differential going around. And I think we have a couple of these to address in today's episode. So we'll start with this one about the Lakers free throw differential. There's a graphic from the Bulls game the other night, and this is not to throw any shade at NBC Chicago, and I think I was watching that part of the game where they put the graphic up, and I don't remember the Bulls broadcasters. You know, Stacey King, he'll get saucy if he needs to. I don't think he said anything too crazy. They were just saying Anthony Davis is a beast. The Lakers defense has been good. Davis was at the free throw line again and again. They put this graphic up about how the Lakers have a huge free throw differential over the rest of the league. So what that means is on offense, they take a ton of free throws. And on defense, they don't give up a ton of free throws. They don't foul in shooting situations as much as other teams. It creates a good differential. And in the Lakers' case, they have the best differential in the league right now. I think it was plus 5.6 per game the other day when I tweeted it. It's up to plus 5.7. And so because this season, the second best differential in the league is like 2.5 per game. Sacramento Kings are about 2.5. The Miami Heat are 2.5. The rest of the pack is basically back at, plus 2, plus 1. They put this graphic up, and it's like the Lakers look like they're light years ahead of everyone else. And they did it in raw free throws, not free throws per game. So it's like Lakers free throws differential, plus 480. Next closest team, plus 100. Cody, you can imagine that led to some interesting conversations on the interwebs.
Oh, absolutely. Because I feel like anytime the Lakers are brought up in this kind of thing, like the conspiracies pop up, it's like, oh, they just want the Anthony Davis LeBron show in there. And I feel like some players are starting to peddle in this a little bit more than I would like in a public setting, saying things about free throw differentials and whatnot. But I don't know, man. I don't like it that people jump to that immediately. I looked at some of the per 100 numbers. So if you look at it, the Lakers are actually second in the NBA in free throw attempts per 100 at 26.3. So they're not even in the lead for the amount of free throws per 100. I think the 76ers, at the time I checked, I think it was this morning I checked it, I think the 76ers take the most free throw attempts per 100. But they were first in allowing an opponent free throw attempts per 100 by a large margin. It was 20.7, and second was Golden State with 24.8. So it's actually not even them necessarily drawing that many free throws. It's the fact that they're keeping teams from taking a lot of free throws in their games.
Yeah, that is, I think, consistent with having Anthony Davis in there. They play Wenyen Gabriel. They're now playing Wenyen Gabriel at 4 sometimes, and he's had really good minutes. And we've talked about this since the trade deadline, since this new Laker team that has come on board with Jared Vanderbilt. And of course, we did a really fun video this week on Jared Vanderbilt, so we'll talk about that we'll circle back to that later in the show if you're tuning in to listen to that talk. The Lakers defense is, I think they're second now since the trade deadline, but they've been one of the first or second best defenses in the league for over a month. Earlier in the year when they started to get things together, again, it was the defense. I mean, LeBron James, even at his advanced age, is still a huge body, really smart defender. So they just have a ton of size. They protect the paint. And the other part of this is these things are largely stylistic, right? Like there's no specific thing that says if you have a big free throw differential, you're the best team. I mean, they're putting this graphic up while the Lakers are, under 500. They've now climbed over 500 for the first time in the season. But if you historically go back, sometimes teams aren't very good and they lead the league in free throw differential. And so sometimes, Cody, I feel like we should just rename the podcast like Debunking Conspiracies. And in the old days, we'd have like an episode a month, and now we'd need like multiple episodes a day to play whack-a-mole and crush all of the thoughts that have been popping up. Like you said, some players are dabbling this maybe in public settings a little more than you're comfortable with. But for the perspective on the Lakers thing here, 2023, as we said, they're about +3 on the second closest team. They are +5.7. That is the 15th highest margin this century. I went back to 2000. The highest margin this century belongs to the 2018 Charlotte Hornets. The 2008, you remember that juggernaut? The 2018 Charlotte Hornets?
Was Kemba even on that team anymore?
They were +8.8.
Oh my God.
In free throw. That means every game, on average, they took 9 more free throws than their opponents. And then some people were asking on Twitter, they were like, well, you've shown me that other leaders are +5, +4, +6. We had the Hornets at +9. Is it normal to be this far ahead of second place? The 2018 Hornets were +8.8. The second place team that year was the Rockets, the James Harden, Chris Paul Rockets. They were +5.5. So an even bigger lead for the Hornets that year. So this is not that atypical of a thing. But Cody, it's been presented as an atypical thing.
I think, well, for the record, by the way, I'm looking at the roster for the 2018 Hornets right now. That was Kemba Walker was still on the team. Dwight Howard was playing 30 minutes a game. And I think even in his advanced age, Dwight Howard was still drawing a good amount of free throws. That was something he was always pretty good at. Offensively, was at least getting to the free throw line, not necessarily capitalizing them, but getting there. It'd be really interesting to go back and see exactly what it is that's causing that differential, because if was it Steve Clifford was the coach? Yeah, Steve Clifford, I think he's pretty consistently a good defensive coach that tries to limit as many free throw attempts as possible. So a lot of interesting variables going into it.
You mentioned Dwight Howard. Dwight Howard was on the 2014 Rockets. They have the second highest free throw differential of the century at +8.6. Dwight Howard was on the 2013 Lakers. They have the third highest differential of the century at +8.5. Other teams up in that territory, 2001 Spurs +8, 2014 Timberwolves +8, the 2000 Charlotte Hornets +8, the 2001 76ers with Allen Iverson and Dikembe Mutombo +7.5. So typically it seems there's some kind of rim protection. You need your defense to not foul a lot around the basket. And then on offense, again, could be stylistic. The Lakers this season kind of play more in the post or try to get more stuff inside and crash with size. So let's put that to bed. I think the big takeaway there to remember is anytime you see a stat that you're not used to seeing, that you don't have a familiarity with, you really can't understand whether it's an outlier or weird or whatever until you contextualize it against other similar seasons and stats with a larger lens. That's the big takeaway to remember there.
I think the thing, too, with free throws that sends everyone into a tizzy when they see it is it's the one stat that you can point to that's not just the player that's doing something, right? Like, there's also the refs that are involved. Like, you can't have a foul unless a ref deems that there's a foul, right? And so that's the easiest one to point to and be like, I see the conspiracy going on here, because I think that's the only stat that you can really point to and do that. I know there was the whole thing with Jaren Jackson and the blocks being miscounted earlier this season, which I hope is also put to bed at some point. But whenever you have like the third party, whether it be the statistician or the ref or something like that, that's when people get involved, because no one's like, oh, Steph Curry, 3-point percentage way, way higher than everyone else. I guess this must be a conspiracy that the Warriors are just going to win. You can't do that with other statistics.
Yeah. Okay. Next misleading statistic that we have to address today. This one, not quite as explicitly misleading, and we'll talk about it and we'll talk about why, but it is an interesting thing that's going around. It did make me recoil just a touch, and I'm going to break my moratorium on talking about these players. This stat is about Nikola Jokic. So Kirk Goldsberry went on the Zach Lowe podcast, the Lowe Post, and he had this line about Jokic allowing more points on layup attempts than I think any other notable big man in the tracking era, something like that. Do you remember the exact line?
Yeah, I think it was. Yeah, he allows the most points on layups over the last decade, because I think that's as far back as the tracking data went.
Okay, and then that's being passed around, right? That's what's happening. Someone took that quote and is passing it around. I think Kirk's exact language is when he's contesting those shots. So there's tracking data. I believe that he's comparing this to going back over the last decade. We have the optical tracking data going back to 2014, and he says specifically he's averaging whatever it is, 12.7 points per game on layups when he's contesting those shots. But also this one might be slightly misleading.
Ooh, tell me about this, because this is one of those things where like eye test Twitter shows up and it's like, yeah, I mean, if you've been watching him, you can tell this is the thing. And, I'm not going to come here and say that Jokic has been a great rim protector. You look at some of the rim protection numbers. Basketball Index has some rim protection numbers. The thinkingbasketball.net site has rim protection numbers. The NBA site has rim protection numbers, and none of them paint Jokic as being a good rim protector. So it's one of those things where, like, you can use the eye test, you can look at some of these numbers and be like, yeah, that tracks with some of these things. What are you thinking when you hear this claim from Kirk?
Well, I haven't read his article, so we did an entire show earlier this year on this sort of two extremes of Jokic as an offensive GOAT candidate, and then, the sort of liability and potential question of can you build a defense that's good enough around him in the postseason to win in today's NBA. So I don't know that I disagree with anything that he says in that article or anything like that. But I think this is yet another example of thinking about how has the game changed since 10 years ago compared to today. We are in the era of, offensive ratings at 116 and 117 compared to 107 or 106 or wherever they were before. So we know there's going to be more high value shots. We know there's going to be more shots around the basket that are probably being converted at a higher percentage. We certainly know that foul calling has changed, and that is going to help your percentages in those paint areas and closer to the basket. So my first thought was like, is something going on where he is like behind the leading big men of this season, but ahead of leading big men of other seasons? That would be one of the first things to check. I said that in a way that confused you, I can tell. Relatively speaking, right?
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. The absolute change this season would be the worst, but what if the fifth worst person this season is still also worse than everyone from 2014 because of the league changes? So that was one component, but the other component that I thought would just be more interesting is to look at data that in theory is more accurate and not less accurate. I've never understood, if we have something like expected field goal percentage inside 6 feet, why would we look at the raw percentage instead, as an example? You're also inquisitively looking at me. Do you want to jump in with a thought there?
Well, I mean, so are you saying that, like, because there are stats, like Basketball Index, for instance, has a stat that's like rim defensive field goal percentage versus expected percentage. So you're saying if we have that expected percentage, that's the number that we should be using instead of just looking at, like, the raw percentage that players are shooting in the paint?
I'm saying if we have something that's more refined, why would we bump back to the raw number? It would kind of be like if we had a nice sample of games over a couple years, and for some reason we wanted to use raw plus minus instead of on off, instead of adjusted plus minus, whatever. It would kind of be like using field goal percentage instead of true shooting percentage or effective field goal percentage. So that's the first thing that kind of jumps out to me about this, like, raw part of it. But the second part is contesting more shots at the basket isn't always a bad thing. That's what threw me a little bit. And so if you actually look, we have on our board at thinkingbasketball.net for rim protection numbers, we have shots inside 6 feet that you've defended according to the optical tracking data. And we have the volume of shots per 36 that you defend. And we have the field goal differential compared to what is expected. Okay? And if you look at that, there are only a few players in the league that defend more shots around the basket per 36 minutes than Jokic. He defends about 9 per 36 minutes. That's 11th, I think, in the last 2 years. The big men ahead of him, guys like Miles Turner, Alperen Şengün is there, Brook Lopez, Drew Eubanks, Walker Kessler, Jakob Poeltl, Zach Collins. Those are all guys ahead of him, along with a few others. So defending more shots at the basket isn't inherently a good thing, but it also isn't inherently a bad thing. And that's baked into this number, right? And so you could be constantly in a position to defend these shots. And because Jokic is weak as a vertical presence, he's providing less resistance. But again, going back to what you said about mapping up to the film, something like that to me would be better than just giving up uncontested layups, right? That's that, or a big man who is completely out of the play and has no ability to influence the play at all. So that's sort of one part of it for me.
The first player that I actually was thinking of was Bam Adebayo here, because I bring him up quite a bit here. Fantastic defensive center in the league. But the thing is, his rim protection numbers really are paltry compared to a lot of centers, and that's because the Heat just don't use him as like a primary rim protector a lot. He's not dropping back like a Brook Lopez or like a Jokic in some of these situations. He's just not near the rim in a lot of these situations because he can switch out and defend probably better than any other center in the league. But because of that, the amount of actual attempts against him at the rim are just significantly less, right? So there is this aspect of what your role is on the team and what the system is dictating that you do when you're out there. But now, of course, I do want to be clear that Jokic is just not a great rim protector comparatively to a lot of these other players, but he is put in the position, like you said, where he is defending a lot of these. So when we take all this, Ben, how would you comment on Jokic's defense right now? Like, do you kind of see him as a neutral level defender this year? Do you think he's maybe a little bit above average? Do you think he maybe slipped below average a little bit? Like, what is your overall thought on what you've seen from him this season?
No, on that episode, they were saying how they think it's his worst defensive season in a while. I think for a lot of the season, it's been his best defensive season just because of his conditioning and his ability to move around. He's more agile than he used to be. He's actually quite extraordinarily agile for a 7-foot guy that really doesn't use burst and isn't a vertical athlete that jumps off the screen. So I think his regular season defense has been solid. I wouldn't say it's good. It's solid. But I don't know how much more clear I can be on this. Again, we did an entire episode devoted to this concept. I think there's a big concern about team building around his defense in the playoffs and what exactly that defensive ceiling looks like. And certainly when I evaluate him as a player, Cody, the last couple seasons, and it's going to be the same thing this season, maybe even more extreme than ever, is like, oh, this guy's in my offensive GOAT candidates. So he's getting a ton of value from his offense. And on the offensive side, that allows him to fit in with a ton of teammates. But as a big man on the defensive side, he's probably a negative. So it's driving some of that backwards. And then it's hard to fit and build around him defensively. So that actually segues to the other part of this kind of stat for me. And again, as I said, this one's not as explicitly misleading as the free throw conversation from the Lakers. But it's interesting because I think if you pluck out a stat like that about a defender who I would say is solid in the regular season and some kind of negative in the playoffs, the stat is framed in a way to sound like he literally is the worst in the league. That's the way it's framed, and that's the way it's being passed around. He's literally the worst in the league at this super important thing, okay? And if you look at the numbers that we have, just right away, Nikola Vucevic in Chicago has been worse in the last 2 years. Players actually shoot above their expected field goal percentage against him at the basket. With Jokic, they're still 1 percentage points below what we expect. Dwight Howell. Let me try that again. Dwight Powell is right next to Jokic. Jonas Valanciunas is also slightly below Jokic in field goal percentage, and he doesn't challenge as many shots at the rim. Domantas Sabonis doesn't challenge as many shots at the rim. He's just above Jokic, so about 2 percentage points worse than expected in terms of defending shots at the basket. Yusuf Nurkic, right next to Jokic, 2 percentage points below. Alperen Şengün, right next to Jokic. And there are probably other players that play less or don't contest as much, but he's in kind of a group. You know who else is near this group, Cody? Who? I hope you're sitting down.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. As I said, the one-time break the seal moratorium for me on this topic because I'm so sick of it. Joel Embiid is in this group. So Joel Embiid contests over the last 2 seasons about 9 shots per 36 at the basket. He's minus 4%. So he's a little better than these guys. As I said, we're talking about minus 2%. Jokic is minus 1%, and so on and so forth. But there's not a huge difference there. And if you turn around and you ask me about Embiid, I kind of go the other way on Embiid. I think I look at the playoffs with Embiid, and I try to see how healthy he is, what kind of motor he has left, and then how engaged he is, how well he's moving, and say, okay, I think he's more focused and more dialed in the playoffs on defense, and his playoff defense is probably better than his regular season defense. Because his regular season defense has been inconsistent to me. He's a player that when he was younger and a little smaller, I thought like, this is interesting. I wonder if this guy could win Defensive Player of the Year. He has not been near that level in the regular season. He has some games where he's great. His rim protection is a huge factor. His presence and size, especially based on opponent, can take away and choke off the basket. I mean, heck, in the Denver game, we saw just taking him off the ball and having him roam sort of away, on the weak side and just play that role was really a huge factor in that game. So he has way more defensive chops, but for a regular season center in today's NBA, he plays a lot of drop and concedes a lot of shots. He works his butt off on offense and doesn't always provide the same effort on defense. He can kind of roam and sit back in the paint, and he doesn't want to come out and close out and rotate and do all these things. So I'm not shocked to see him have these numbers that are in a different league than the guys we usually talk about when we pull these out. Brook Lopez, 13 percentage points below what we expect. Jaren Jackson, Giannis. It's not that kind of thing. So that's why I think presenting this as an isolated thing of like, well, if you look at the total number of points, because Jokic also plays a lot of minutes per game and he plays a lot of games. So it's like, the total number of layups he's giving up is the worst. I think it misrepresents this. Last point on that is all these stats are influenced by your team. Defensive number, all basketball stats are influenced by your team. We've talked about this before, but especially these defensive numbers. I've said explicitly, when I look at these on our board, I pull up the whole team because I want to see where you are relative to your team. And as good as I think the Nuggets are right now, as much of a nice job as they've done filling in some of the roster, they don't have that, Evan Mobley, weak side, power forward, rim protector presence. They don't have that. That's not their defensive strength. Bruce Brown, Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, even Aaron Gordon to some degree, Michael Porter Jr.'s size a little bit. they've tried to boost the defense in that way and create better perimeter defenders, better speed, better quickness, more solid guys that can communicate. But this is not the Celtics. They don't have 2, 3, 4 rim protectors out there at all times. So again, that might sound counterintuitive, but if you just put Jokic on a team with more rim protectors, even from the forward position, that number would almost automatically go from like -1 to -2 or -3. That's what happens with all these numbers. So, end rant.
I think that last point is interesting because when you do think about the weakness that Jokic has, because again, I'm going to say it again, Jokic is not a very strong rim protector. He's not the worst in the league, right? But he's not a very strong one. But the team that they've built, we've talked about this before, they have a solid perimeter-oriented defensive team. Like a lot of those guys can switch around, slow down some players. I don't necessarily know if they have the strongest point of attack defense. I think they're probably better at handling like bigger isolation type heavy folks like the Bruce Browns and Aaron Gordons. They can switch around it a lot, but they're not going to take somebody that's shorter, somebody that's quicker and really shut them down. So it's interesting that they kind of struggle, I think, on both of those ends, on the point of attack end and the rim protection end. And then on Embiid, I think what's interesting is I think this year, his numbers rim protecting have just been worse than previous years, right? You roped in the last 2 years previously, and I think this year's really brought it down. He started off slow, and while he improved significantly, I even think the last couple of weeks, I've noticed his motor dropping a little bit. I feel like I've noticed him moving a little less, a little worse than he did earlier, like in the middle of the season, right? And so just by nature of his strong, he's able to time out blocks. He's massive, right? He can get high above the rim pretty quickly. I think all of that makes him a strong rim protector, but it still makes me have some questions about him defensively. So I think all of this is to say is, Ben, we just need the playoffs at this point. Like, we can keep analyzing and looking at what the season is telling us, what last season is telling us, but at this point, I really just need to see how these guys handle playoff offenses when we get to them in a couple of weeks.
Okay, that's it. I'm taking the key. I'm zipping it up. We're not talking about them ever again. That's the end of that. Let's get to our next sort of. We'll just call it misleading stat. We'll go with the theme today. We did this Jared Vanderbilt video last week, which was a lot of fun to do. A lot of fun to get into Vanderbilt film. He's obviously one of our thinking basketball mascots around here. And then, of course, to get to go back and watch Dennis Rodman. And we'll talk more about that. If you have any questions about that, Cody, I've got a lot of questions, so we can hit that in a little bit. But one of the things that came up right away with the Vanderbilt video was his stats. So again, we're on like, okay, what about these stats? And there's this quirky little thing happening this season with Vanderbilt's plus-minus stats, and specifically how it's influencing his defensive stats, especially like one-number defensive stats that try to capture value, defensive EPM, defensive Raptor, defensive LeBron, all the acronyms we have that try to boil down player value into points per 100 possessions. And I gotta say, when I was watching Vando and went to make this video, I was confused because we did something. Unbeknownst to all the commenters of YouTube, we actually cover the Minnesota Timberwolves a ton, not just the Los Angeles Lakers. And we can't quit the Timberwolves. So we had done a video on their defense last season. And Mike, our wonderful video coordinator, Mike De La Rosa, literally wrote a little love letter to Vanderbilt in that video on his weak side help and how he's so perfect helping in these hedge situations for weaker, like big man defenders like Karl Anthony Towns. So Vanderbilt goes to Utah, and then he goes to Los Angeles. I don't know about you, Cody. I didn't watch too much Utah this season, only a handful of times when they were playing other teams I was scouting. But then he goes to the Lakers, and I start watching this brand new Lakers team, and I'm like, man, Vanderbilt looks better than ever. He's like a menace. He looks amazing. And having a 6'9" guy in today's game that can move like this and have this defensive versatility. I mean, I think you used the word last time. They just sick him on the point guard sometimes, or these big lead wing ball handlers in the West. And it's really good. It's really good. It's not like Hall of Fame, but it's like really, really good. And then you go look at the numbers, and his defensive numbers are all down this year. They're like minus 0.2 or plus 0.1. And in the prior seasons, if you look at something like defensive EPM, he's like one of the best defenders in the league. He's like +2, +3. Should this guy really be on one of the 2 all-defensive teams? As an aside, voters, please, the man has never received a vote for all-defensive team. Please, amend this. He should be in the conversation. I digress. And I was like, what's going on here? Why the sudden change? Why did this guy used to be +3 in defensive EPM and LeBron and all these stats, and now he's like neutral? Well, plus-minus is a big driver of these stats. And in Utah, there was a very strange rotational quirk that we were able to discover. Jazz fans probably know what's coming right away. Vanderbilt never played with Walker Kessler. Their Rudy Gobert replacing rim protecting stud. We were talking about those rim protection numbers earlier around the league. And Walker Kessler, as a rookie, he's in the lower right-hand corner of our graph. He is minus 13% on shots against him. That's 13% worse than expected around the basket inside 6 feet. And he defends 10 of them per 36 minutes, which is also at the top of the league. So he's like at the top of the league in defensive volume rim protection and defensive percentage rim protection. And Jared Vanderbilt never got to play with him. And the reason he never got to play with him is because I think Will Hardy just basically said, I don't ever want 2 non-shooters on the court. So Walker Kessler is a non-shooter. He doesn't play. And then what would happen is Vanderbilt would play only with Kelly Olynyk, who, of course, is not renowned as a defensive stopper or defensive center. Kelly Olynyk goes right back into that category, that Jokic, Vucevic. He's kind of in that ballpark if you graph where these guys are. So what that does, and when I say all these minutes, I mean like he played like 50 minutes with Walker Kessler, and it's like 98.5% of his minutes were strictly with Kelly Olynyk or no Kelly Olynyk and no Walker Kessler small ball lineups. And so what that means is there's only so much you can adjust for these 2 players going in and out of the lineup together and never playing together. The fancy term is collinearity or multicollinearity, but it's a very hard thing to disentangle statistically. And I think it's the number one reason why his stats this season have taken a huge deviation from prior seasons. And it's a really, really interesting thing to think about, because it's not like this all defensive level player suddenly just got bad overnight and then went to the Lakers and got good again. It's more like, 1, context matters, and 2, sometimes you get extreme cases that really, really, really warp the defensive numbers.
All right, a couple of things here. I want to contextualize Walker Kessler's rim protection numbers, because of the numbers that I like to check in on like throughout multiple years, rim protection is one of my like pet things. Like if you have the bingo card out, you probably know I like to talk about rim protection. But if you're in the zone of like defending about 10 shots per 75 or 10 shots a game or whatever else, and you're holding players to like a -13 versus expected, that's really good. That we're talking like literally the best in the league sort of thing. Like you look at the peak Rudy Gobert sorts of numbers, like that's what you're pulling up. And I know there's some like weird outlier seasons, like the 2020 Bucks, for instance, really weird out. Like Brook Lopez and Giannis are holding players like -20 versus expected. Like you don't see that sort of thing like ever. I think that was mostly a fluke. I don't know what was going on there,
it's
but you
noise.
look at like
it's
a lot of that is noise. But if you look at Jaren Jackson, Evan Mobley as a rookie, -13, -14. So Walker Kessler's right at the top. The other thing that's interesting about Vanderbilt, though, is he's a great defender. I don't know if you agree with this, but he's not a defense unto himself. Like when we talk about guys like Rudy Gobert and Walker Kessler, like even as rookie Walker Kessler, you can throw these guys out there and then build the defense around that, right? Like you can be like, all right, we're going to kind of funnel players towards them. We're going to go to drop and they can kind of protect the rim, which is the most advantageous place to defend on the court. Vanderbilt doesn't necessarily do that. He's not big enough. He's not brawny enough to do that. He's an okay rim protector, but he's not a great rim protector relative to some of these other guys. So I think that's the interesting thing about these sorts of defenders is he's not the kind of guy that you're going to build the defense around, but if you have other defensive pieces, he's going to really ratchet up the defense. He's going to add on to other defensive parts that you have, whereas you can't necessarily like combine multiple rim protectors like a Walker Kessler, like a Jarrett Allen, and then make them into a strong defense. So I think that's a really interesting part of Vanderbilt's defensive style and value.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's a lot there. One is the sort of defensive fit and versatility has now become more of a thing than ever before, because I don't think you can stack rim protectors like you could in the past. It's harder to do that because these guys are giving up too much mobility. And then with Vanderbilt, I mean, he's super versatile. He's plugging holes. He's fitting next to different players. He can guard the point of attack. He can guard big wings. I agree with you. You're not going to play him at center, and he's not going to be a defense unto himself, but he just fits incredibly well in those situations. One stat I wanted to pull up, I alluded to it earlier, and I forgot to mention it. Karl Anthony Towns, it goes back to the conversation with the quote-unquote Jokic giving up the most the guy in Denver we had a moratorium on. The guy in Denver we were talking about. But like if you look at Cat last season, 2021, 2022, he is contesting far fewer shots at the basket, and he's about -2%. So he's like in the same area, but he contests way fewer shots. And then this season, he gets to play some minutes with Gobert, and now that's starting to move a little bit. Now it's like -3% for Cat, just because when you have a defensive infrastructure where Rudy Gobert is on one side of you and spoiler alert, Jaden McDaniels is on the other side of you, that guy's good. It's going to make all the shots the offense on the other side takes much harder, and it's going to influence these numbers. Anyway, back to Vando. That's the plus-minus side of things, Cody. So I think now that he's back in Los Angeles with Anthony Davis next to him, with LeBron James next to him, with Darvin Ham seemingly being more defensively oriented as a coach, I think those numbers will move in the opposite direction. I think off the top of my head, in the last month, his plus-minus numbers in Los Angeles have been really good. We'll double-check those in a second. But there's another side of the Vanderbilt stat equation, which is people were very confused about the Rodman comparison when I said these are guys that on offense don't do any of their own stuff, but offensive rebounding is a huge part of their game. And if you go to the offensive rebound leaders, let's say you go to Basketball Reference, right? And you pull up the leaders in offensive rebounding percentage, you will not see Jared Vanderbilt at the top of the league. And I think that confuses people because they're like, wait a second. How can you compare Dennis Rodman grabbing 18 boards a game 25 years ago? However, how long ago did he play? What year is it? 30 years ago? Man, wow. It was like 30 years ago. 18 boards per game. And Rodman literally has the all-time single-season record for offensive rebounding percentage and career record for offensive rebounding percentage. For those who don't know, offensive rebounding percentage is just the percentage of total available rebounds that you grab. So it takes into account how many shots are being missed and how many shots are going in. So Rodman is the king of this category. Why would you compare Jared Vanderbilt, who's like not even in the top 20 this season, to Rodman? And the simple answer, and this was a big motivator behind the video, is how much the game has changed. The game has changed immensely. And what we're seeing with guys leading the league in offensive rebounding isn't a kind of positional grit and toughness and nose to the ball and strength and box out technique and anticipation. None of that really applies as much anymore because the game is so spread out. 3, 4, 5 players are behind the arc when a shot goes up. And what we see dominating the top of the offensive rebounding leaderboards are rim running big men who set a lot of screens and dive to the basket and try to get position and tips and putbacks that way, or guys that hang out in the dunker spot because they're not shooters. Because if you're a shooter, you're usually camped behind the line, and that suppresses your offensive rebounding percentage numbers. And I'll give you some stats in a second, but I want to let you react to that.
Well, also there's the idea too that teams are sort of limiting the amount of offensive rebounds they want their players to go to, because I think when you look at the analytics, you want to get back and play transition defense and get yourself set. And Vanderbilt being a great defensive player, you probably want him to be back quicker. So it's not necessarily like he's crashing the glass like Dennis Rodman would have been in the 90s. Is that also right?
Yeah, exactly. You could not, there just literally isn't a place on the court where you can go hang out and do nothing and not set screens, and there's like 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 bodies in the paint, and you're kind of just like you're at a club. It's like late at night in a club, and you're just jockeying for position, and you're like the DJ's playing the songs, and I'm going to slip by this guy, I'm going to put my hand on this guy's shorts, and now I'm ready to go. I could tip it to myself, or I could box out. That's not how a lot of these offensive rebounds, or rebounds in general, are being generated anymore. We did an entire episode a couple years ago, which I think is like called Rebounding, or the Rebounding episode, or something like that. So I'll point people to that if they're more interested in how radically this stuff has changed over the decades. But it really jumped out to me here because if you look at the leaders, Mitchell Robinson, Clint Capella, Kevon Looney, Jalen Duren, Walker Kessler, Isaiah Hartenstein, Jonas Valanciunas, Jakob Poeltl, Onyeka Okongwu, Rudy Gobert, in addition to being very international and challenging my pronunciation on all kinds of long names, none of those guys shoot threes. Valanciunas shoots about 13% of his shots from three, Hartenstein 12%. But for the most part, we're talking about non-shooters who are rim runners. And so if you try to think about like how good Vanderbilt is as a rebounder, even statistically, I think you have to account for the difference between somebody sitting out on the three-point line and not even involved versus these are the guys the team strategically and tactically has near the basket to have a chance to rebound.
And I'm thinking about the way that like 90s basketball look, where you have like the big bruising power forward next to the center. So you basically have two big men out there. And when a shot goes up, both of them are crashing the glass trying to get the offensive rebound. That's not necessarily the case here. So I think it sounds like you're saying that a player playing in Vanderbilt's sort of role, in his position, in the way that he's supposed to be playing out on the court, he's doing about as well as he could. He's like maximizing his offensive rebounding potential.
He's doing very well, I think. So if you, again, I don't know the perfect way to adjust for this, but something that I did before making the video and was thinking about like what's actually happening here is I went and I looked at who grabs rebounds where they shoot some threes. And I made the cutoff 14%. I basically made the cutoff where Jonas Valanciunas was. Okay. And I said, if you look at the league leaders in offensive rebounding percentage based on guys that do take threes, Jonas, Tari Eason, Chris Boucher, Jared Vanderbilt, Yusuf Nurkic, Aaron Gordon, Bobby Portis, Isaiah Stewart, those are the best rebounders in the league statistically among guys that take threes, at least 14% of their shots from downtown, which isn't a huge number. But I just want to differentiate between the guys that just like almost never take threes and the guys that are going to be out space behind the arc on some of these possessions and shots. Okay, the next step, Cody, was a simple little thing to remove self-offensive rebounds, because that to me is a different thing than like crashing the glass and having these opportunistic second chances. We've talked about this before. It's the old Zebo. You're in the post, you turn, you shoot, you tip it back up. That's not what I'm thinking about either. So you do that, you're literally this is the leaderboard you're left with. Jonas Valanciunas grabs 9.5% of all available offensive rebounds. For comparison, back in the day when Rodman played, I mean, he could just sit under the basket, and his all-time single-season records for offensive rebounding percentage, I think, are like 17%, 18%. You can double-check me on that, but it's a totally different game. Chris Boucher is second this season at 9.4%. Guess who's third?
I'm going to guess Jared Vanderbilt.
Jared Vanderbilt, just under 9%. Tari Eason's 8%. And then you get a drop-off to Yusuf Nurkic, Aaron Gordon, Bobby Portis. Those guys are all 7%. Wendell Carter Jr., your guy in Orlando, 7%. Then even after that, there's another drop-off. So Jonas, this guy who clearly uses his body, very difficult to dislodge when he gets switches or mismatches, he's doing damage. And then you have these two crashers from the outside. Chris Boucher is obviously taller and can be on the post more. He might be involved in more pick and rolls. But for a guy not setting a lot of pick and rolls, like Jonas sets more screens and can roll to the basket and get tips. Vanderbilt doesn't really do that. So your eyes are not deceiving you when you watch him play and he comes flying in from the perimeter and just outworks, out-times, out-anticipates everyone, skies for the ball, keeps it alive. That's a rare skill in today's game. And the last point on this is something you already said. Teams don't want to do this because they don't want to get beat in transition. Vanderbilt's having his cake and eating it too because his motor's so high, right? He's like, I could chase these rebounds down to the baseline, and then if I miss them, I can just run back and out-sprint everybody back on D. And heck, I'm so good, sometimes I'll get steals while I'm not even looking at the ball running back down court. It's pretty cool.
Ben, let me ask a question to clarify something for your favorite kind of comments on YouTube. I'm going to feed the people that you just love hearing from on YouTube. The people that comment and say things like, "No, how can you compare him to Dennis Rodman? What's wrong with you?" So let me ask you this to try and clarify this, Ben. Are you essentially saying that if Dennis Rodman were to play in today's NBA, this is probably how his sort of play style would look? Not necessarily that Jared Vanderbilt's as good as Dennis Rodman. That's not what you're saying. But if Dennis Rodman were to play in today's league, he would probably be lumped into this group, and this is probably how his offensive rebounding would look and be adjusted.
Well, I don't know if it would literally be Vanderbilt because they're slightly different athletically. They're similar, but there's some differences. But the point is, it would look something more like this. He could not play the same way. It's just impossible. Unless you're going to say that, I mean, he's probably about 6'7", unless you're going to somehow say he would have found a way to be like a rim-running vertical lob threat as a 6'7" undersized center, which seems, Cody's making a face like, it just seems unlikely. It seems almost impossible. And if that's the case, that means A, he would have had to find other ways to contribute, and B, those other ways might have been things like PJ Tucker corner three. Like, I learned how to space behind the line, and then I'm a defender, and I crash the glass. He could dribble a little bit for that era. He'd probably try to boost his handle a little bit more in the same way we talked about people like Grant Williams being able to attack closeouts. But especially the offensive rebounding side of things, Cody, it is thought by some people, it's up for debate, that his offensive rebounding drove huge offensive value, right? Just like all these extra possessions he was able to scoop up, especially playing next to scorers with Jordan and Pippen. And like, you want to talk about differentials, just gaining extra shots for his teams everywhere he went. However big that advantage was, I don't know. Maybe it was a little bit, maybe it was a lot. The point is, he couldn't play like that on the offensive side today. So it would probably look something more like this, where he's finding ways to rebound and contribute and do these other things. A guy like Vanderbilt does this. That's what's so interesting to me. Yeah.
I want to focus on a specific skill that you brought up that Vanderbilt has. This kind of nebulous term that you bring up a lot, you talk about a lot. I bring it up. I like it. I think it's good at describing things, but I think it's really hard to define, and I don't know how to like scientifically investigate it at all. Ben, what are you even talking about when you say that he has a high motor?
Oh, motor.
What did you think I was going to say? Wait, what did you think I was going to say?
No, well, I was so excited. You were talking about it for a while, and I wasn't sure where you were going. I love motor. I love it. It's interesting. In making the video, I was thinking about it more. I don't even know how much I thought about this as a skill or a differentiable value add when I was growing up, right? Mm-hmm. I think I started to think about it more in the mid to late 2000s when, speaking of things that were very toxic on the internet, there was a lot of like Kobe Bryant arguments about either LeBron James or Michael Jordan. And there's obviously similarities between Kobe and Michael Jordan, both aesthetically and functionally as players. And one thing I kept trying to, it took me a while, but this is where I started to realize like motor's like really a thing. I was trying to talk about some of the differences with these guys, and I realized how big the motor component was. Kobe doesn't have a bad motor, but if you watch him, he's idling more out there. You go watch like young Jordan, you go watch like 88 to 92 Jordan. The guy's like, I don't know what was wrong with him. He's like, I'm going to gamble all night. I'm going to play 36 holes of golf, and I'm going to play 48 minutes in a playoff game and run around like a terror. That's what we mean by motor. So if I had to try to define it, I would say it's essentially how much you're moving. It's essentially the opposite of idleness. It's like non-idleness. And I don't just mean moving is the number of miles that you run, right? We can track that. We can say, okay, this guy ran 2.6 miles in the game and this guy ran 2.4 miles. To me, motor is more, even than the long distance you run, is more about short space activity in basketball. Fighting for position, constantly improving where you are, battling with guys. If you're off ball, cutting and then counter cutting and then back cutting and just continuously going and moving and hand fighting and do it whatever it takes. If you're on defense, feigning in one direction, stunting, recovering, jabbing versus just sitting there. If you're like the weak side zone guy and you just sit there, that's idle. A higher motor would be like bouncing and moving and going left and right. These things start to add up. And for some players, they add a ton of value. And if you like took one player's motor and you swapped it with another player, you go from like an all-star to a role player. It's really kind of an incredible thing to think about.
And this is where I get confused about it, because I can think of examples. Like I remember scouting Andrei Kirilenko a few years ago, and just like the amount, like in one possession where he's like, the ball's just kind of swinging around. Maybe one person's just holding it. He's literally just dancing back and forth. Like there's no real movement. He's just dancing, ready to be shot out of a cannon. Allen Iverson is another good one. When you talk about guys that stay out late, come in, can play like 47 minutes and are just all over the place, Allen Iverson had a high motor. I think guys with high motors, especially good offensive players, are generally very popular. Kevin Garnett, literally headbutting the stanchion before games. Like this guy I don't think he can physically stop talking. Right? And I think that's the interesting thing is, on one hand, most of these guys are very highly conditioned. I can think of someone maybe in Dallas that I would like to be more conditioned. But all of these guys are very highly conditioned, right? The very high level of cardio training, okay? So there is a difference between in being really good cardiovascular shape and being able to run a lot in a basketball game, and then just having like energy that's kind of overflowing to the point where you just can't stop jittering. Yep. And I don't know how to differentiate these things. I was literally like on Google Scholar trying to like find some kind of thing that would get me into an entry point that's like, what is this? How do you improve it? I don't know. And it's definitely a thing that's real that I can't scientifically point to and be like, this is what it is.
It's fascinating because the cardio component, like that guy in Denver lost weight, it upped his cardio. I think it added value on offense and defense, but he's always had a high motor in the sense that he's like bouncing around, gets the ball, quickly makes a move, chases the ball, rescreens, handoff, dive. That's what it is, especially in basketball. It's this jitteriness. It's this perpetual movement in short spaces that then translates to like actual basketball value. And what's fascinating, as you said, looking at it through the literature, I'm going back and thinking about my cognitive athleticism models and all my undergrad research on expertise. And it's just like, it's a hard thing to define because it feels like something that wants to be synonymous with effort, but it's not. Right? It feels like something that the coach is just like, all right, in practice, we were low motor. Now it's the fourth quarter. Everyone high motor. And it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way at all. It seems like a thing that by the time you get to the NBA is almost static. Like we were talking about it in our group chat this week. Can you think of anyone that's changed their motor in their NBA careers? They're like a player that came in and he was a low motor player, and then a few years later, he's like, I just figured it out. I took a lot of caffeine before the game. Like, I think Darryl Armstrong of the Magic, I think he used to drink coffee, like right before, in the locker room, right before he'd go out. He'd talk about how he was a jittery high motor, like super high motor guy. Bo Outlaw on that team was another high motor guy. These guys just like working, constantly moving. And yet by the time you're good at your craft, by the time you're great at your craft and you're in the NBA, it seems like your movement patterns and that relationship to your energy or the overall larger quote unquote cardio that you mentioned seems pretty fixed, which feels crazy. It's just fascinating to me.
And the relationship with the cardio aspect. Like, again, if you try playing basketball and you're not in shape, like I'm just talking about the lay people out there that show up to like their LA Fitness and they're like, I'm going to get a run in. And you see the lane. You're like, if I cut, I'm going to get a layup. And then you just can't. Like, it's just not there, right? So to unlock this level of motor, you have to be in really good shape, right? Like, there definitely is some kind of relationship between the two. You can't have a high motor without being in really good shape, right? But you want to jump in.
Well, because this is where the trained athlete part comes in, right? All these guys are already in great shape relative to where they were when they were younger or the rest of the population. And I think when you're a kid, I imagine you can change your motor a lot when you're growing up and you're a kid. And maybe we can talk about some reasons why. But by the time you get to, like, I'm a professional athlete, when we even Luka that you mentioned earlier, it's not going to change his motor necessarily. It's just going to change, now he can play 42 minutes a game. Now he doesn't tire in the fourth quarter. Now he's more willing to rotate on defense. It's that kind of thing, I think.
And I think, we talk about, I can't think of any examples of people necessarily gaining a motor after coming into the league without it, but I think reining it in is a skill in itself. You bring up Michael Jordan. You go and watch like 87, 88, this guy's flying out of a cannon. It's ridiculous the amount of things he goes for. But the thing is it kind of hurts him at times because he's jumping for pump fakes. He's just like arms everywhere, flying into screens, not able to get around him. Randy Whitman's over here hitting a jump shot, and Jordan's just left in the dust. He's actually better as a defender when he's like, all right, I'm going to pick my spots better. I still have this ability to kind of fly all over the place, right? But I'm not quite as wild. It's like the Matisse Thybulle nowadays. I think that was actually kind of the comparison you had, as Matisse Thybulle sort of plays defense like late 80s Michael Jordan, right? And Thybulle's incredible. And without that motor, he wouldn't be as good of a defensive player. But you can also see him even being a better defender if it's like, all right, dude, let's just not jump for that pump fake like once in a while. That'll help you a little bit. But so I think that's the one thing is you can have it and control it, but I don't know if you can, like you said, I don't know if you can not have it and develop it and unleash it. But you think, I don't know, is there a way that somebody in their youth would be able to develop a motor?
Well, I think what happens in your youth is it's more impressionable. It's more flexible. So you're listening to what coaches tell you to do. Go stand there. Go put your arms out. Go do this drill, et cetera, et cetera. And if you're from Mark Madsen to Kevin Garnett to Patrick Beverley to Jared Vanderbilt, whatever, if you develop a way to get in the game based on moving more and being more active, then I think, in a sense, that's training a higher motor basketball player. The flip side is if you can be really successful and you don't have to do that, the big term here, and I'm sure someone is yelling this at their radio right now, is conservation of energy, right? These great athletes, the superstars of basketball, I imagine the flip side of this coin is they're conserving energy. I think that's where you were going with the Jordan thing, right? Like you watch later stage Jordan and he knew when to pick his spots. He knew how to play. I'm going to play 42 minutes tonight. So when can I just literally let my body rest for a few seconds? When can I jog instead of sprinting? When do I, like LeBron maybe is an even better example of this. When do I just not close out? Some people have performative closeouts, right? The coach will yell at him. The fans will yell at him. At some point in his career, a number of years ago, LeBron gave up on that. He does the opposite. He does performative, not going to close out. He's like, oh, there's a shooter in the corner. I'm 18 feet away. I'm just going to stand under the basket. I don't care how long he's out there. I'm not doing anything.
I was a goalkeeper in another life, right, for soccer. And one thing that I was taught early on is even if there's a ball that there's no chance of getting to, just go for it so it at least looks good. At least no one can say you didn't try on that. It's that sort of thing.
No, it's the exact same thing. And in LeBron's case, he's carrying a huge offensive load. He's doing so much. He's a particularly interesting example because He's an extraordinary cardiovascular athlete. On the JJ Redick pod recently, Al Horford was talking about how in 2018 at the end of Game 7 they came out of like the last timeout, everyone's exhausted, and LeBron's over there and he looks like he doesn't have a bead of sweat on him, and he looks like he can run a marathon, and he played all 48 minutes in that game at what year was that? I mean, he must have been about 33. I think so. Yeah, he was 33 and a half when that game took place. So he's an extraordinary cardiovascular athlete. Maybe not necessarily a Curry or Reggie Miller, a John Havlicek, but clearly something there. And yet, as an offensive player, picks his spots, dictates tempo, conserves his energy on defense. My question is, if you said to LeBron at any point in his career, hey, you're going to play 23 minutes a night, that's it. And we would like you to be more disruptive defensively, and we're going to have Magic Johnson run the offense, and you just kind of like streak around. What would that look like? Would we watch the game and go, this guy's one of the highest motors ever because of the point of conservation of energy? Or would it be a little more balanced? Would it be like, oh, he's got more motor, he's way more active, but he's still not Dennis Rodman, he's still not Kevin Garnett, he's still not just jiggling and vibrating and constantly moving. So much so that I actually wonder how much your off-court motor influences your on-court basketball motor. Is things like ADHD or jitteriness, or just like, I mean, I had people in my family who they just couldn't stop moving. They just can't stop. It doesn't matter how old they are or what they're doing. They got to clean this. They got to garden this. They got to vacuum this. They got to get in the car. They got to do that. It's just like perpetual. And I wonder how much of that translates onto the basketball court. I've said this before. You know, you watch Kevin Garnett. He's like doing an interview. Wants to get up. He wants to get up and start running around and moving. So yeah, I don't know if you have thoughts on that, but it's really, really interesting to think about what we actually mean by motor and can it change.
I think the LeBron thing where you say if you had reduced his offensive load, what was his defense look like? Because my initial reaction is, yeah, he'd be even a better defensive player. But if you said the same thing about Kevin Garnett, if you were like, all right, KG, you don't have to do anything on offense. We're just going to have you do everything on defense. Put all of your energy. I legitimately don't know if he could go a level higher than he already did, right? Like when you watch Kevin Garnett, you're not like, I think he left something on the table that defensive possession. Like, and I think that's the separator. And I'm not going at LeBron or anything, but we're talking about this one discrete skill that, again, we can't even scientifically point to and say what it is. But whatever it is, Kevin Garnett has it. And when you have guys like that, there's just no bringing it back. And unfortunately, I think these are the guys like Allen Iverson, retired by like 32, 31, right? Like your career just doesn't last as long. I guess Kevin Garnett lasted pretty long. Kevin Garnett's just an outlier. He's just
okay. So 2009, I was covering the Lakers. I was in the Chick Hearn press room in Los Angeles for a game, and this conversation breaks out. Before the game, they'll put there's TVs in the press room and you can see other games. Well, the Celtics were playing the first half of the TNT doubleheader. The Lakers that night at Staples were playing the second half. And there's some conversation that breaks out watching this game about how Kevin Garnett is playing like a total maniac. And you just can't, like, your body's going to break down when you do that. That's not sustainable. And what's interesting is he came into the league in 1996 and he basically played like that for like 17 years. So, Cody, I don't know what to make of that because I feel like it's correct. Like, you should not be able to play with the max movement turbo button pressed on your controller for every possession you ever play for your entire career for 17 years. But somehow he did it. So I don't know. Like I'm saying, maybe this motor thing transcends cardiovascular performance. It's some greater cognitive nervous system sort of energy component. All this energy's got to come out of you somehow.
I just love this. I love that it's this one thing that's undefinable right now. Like, we can throw out theories, and I don't even know how to search for the question. But I could talk. I said this once in an earlier episode, Ben. I said we need more stories. Like we have all the Kobe Bryant work ethic stories. We need more stories like showing the incredible cardio levels of some of these athletes. So that Al Horford story about LeBron, we need more of that. We need more of it from guys like Steph Curry. We need someone to come and be like, oh, it was the fourth quarter, and Jared Vanderbilt, he was like running laps during the timeout. Like, we just didn't know what to do about him.
Let's leave on this. The NBA is switching to tracking. They're switching their tracking for the optical cameras next year, and we will be getting, if you're familiar with tennis, the Hawkeye technology. You know, I know, Cody, you never watch any other sports, but if you've ever seen tennis and the ball, they show the replay, they challenge, and the ball, like, it's in on the line, it's out on the line.
Yep.
You know what I'm talking about?
I've seen what you're talking about. Yeah.
The crowd oohs and it's beautiful. The crowd oohs and ahs as the ball, as the simulation shows the ball and where it lands. I think we might be able to, at least statistically, it still might be a nebulous origin story. Like, where does this come from? How can you change it? But we could maybe track motor a little bit better now versus just who ran the most miles. Because to come full circle for like misleading stats, running the most miles isn't inherently a good thing necessarily. It depends on your role. It depends on your scheme. It depends on your system. So you can't just go and look up like, this player ran the most miles, they have the highest motor. This player ran the 100th most miles, they have the 100th highest motor. That's not it at all. But next season, with the Hawkeye technology, instead of having one single data point for a player, which is now their center, their quote-unquote center of mass, like the middle of their body, that the computer tracks. If anyone's unfamiliar with this, think about 10 dots on a court, 5 for the home team, 5 for the away team. There's one more for the ball, and the cameras know where these are moving at all times. Instead of one of those points, I believe they'll be tracking 29 points on the body. So we will now have access to a player's arms, their hands, their legs, their head, which direction they're looking, things like that. In addition to opening up a whole host of stats and other things, this also means that in theory, we could capture how active you are with your feet and your legs. What kind of jab steps and stunts? Do you feint toward the ball and then hop back in the other direction? How often do you stand still, right? Like, there's a ton of other things that we could capture. And there's a concept in health and nutrition called NEAT. Do you know about this, Cody? NEAT? Have you heard of NEAT?
I do know about NEAT. Yeah. Basically like the amount that you just like move throughout the day.
Exactly. It is, what is it? Non-exercise activity thermogenesis. I don't know if I got that totally wrong. In essence, it's all this activity you're doing throughout the day that's not exercise. That's what it is. So we used to think in fitness and nutrition, hey, how much like lean mass do you have, and how much do you eat, and how much do you exercise, and then we can figure out whether you're losing weight or gaining weight. It turns out that all these little non-exercise movements, like if you watch us on YouTube and you see me moving my hands around when I talk, and you get up from your desk at work and you get down, or you fidget, you bounce your leg up and down, all those things add up. And when you study people, it can be like 300-400 extra calories you're burning a day just because of how much you jitter and move around. So we could have an analogous thing that we could track going forward with just like who is idling and then who's burning hot in every direction, jiggling around on the basketball court. And maybe that will help us capture motor and make some deeper insights about how it unlocks things for players like Jared Vanderbilt out there.
I hope this data is available to the public. I'm afraid it's going to be behind some kind of impenetrable paywall that only is released once in a while by some ESPN reporter on Twitter. So I hope they at least throw us some nuggets that we can feast on to see how Jared Vanderbilt moves on the court.
Yeah, that would be nice. Anything else on this topic before we get out of here?
Man, now that you started NEAT, I'm like, we could go in a lot of different directions. But I'm looking at the time. I don't think the people want this in an hour and 10 minutes. Maybe in the off season we could really have a fitness level conversation at some point. But
yeah, we'll just do an entire podcast on NEAT and like burning calories in the off season, and we'll start it up with Peter Piper pickled peppers. If you want to support this show, check out patreon.com/thinkingbasketball. Remember, you can also sign up right now for $300 off at sportsbusinessclassroom.com with the code thinkingbasketball. That'll be a lot of fun, hopefully not hopefully, definitely it'll be a lot of fun. I was going to say, hopefully I also can make it out there to Las Vegas this summer for Summer League. Hopefully Summer League is spectacular. That is it. Thanks as always for listening all the way through, and I hope you are having a great day.